Cześć, hello, witam and welcome to Pierogi de Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matulewicz. Each year on March 17th, cities and towns across the United States find themselves awash in the color green, the legendary hue of the Emerald Isle, as Irish and Irish Americans celebrate the feast day of St. Patrick, Ireland's patron saint. Parades and lively music fill the atmosphere with jovial sense of laughter and fun, with tall, dark pints of Guinness and cries of Sláinte at the clink of said glasses. Yet the festive nature of these celebrations today can sometimes mask the rather difficult and painful history of Ireland, which contains a long and tumultuous story of civil war, famine, oppression, and conflict that has existed for hundreds of years. Now, you may rightly be wondering, what on earth this introduction to Irish history and culture is doing on a Polish-themed podcast? Especially since I saw a shirt once that said, "Everyone is Irish on St. Patrick's Day, except the Polish. Polish are still Polish." Although that saying is a pithy and good-natured jeer at the overshadowing that this day of Irish pride may evoke, I suspect that what was behind it may be the historical fact that Central, Eastern, and Southern Europeans were met with intense hatred and bigotry in the early 1900s, when the more well-established Irish, many of whom had immigrated during the potato famine in the 1840s, saw these newcomers as a threat to their job security and way of life. Acts of discrimination and even violence over work and territory were all too common occurrences in these years, as the tragic pattern of hatred of newcomers that the Irish themselves experienced from Anglo-Saxon Protestant colonial settlers upon their arrival was repeated. In a display of shameless hypocrisy, the latest immigrants, with their strange languages and customs, were seen as an immediate threat to the identity of Americans. Yet across the Atlantic and Ireland itself, a different type of clash between the Irish and their British occupiers had been even more violent and long-lasting. The English occupation of Ireland had reached back to the 16th century. This animosity with the English was made more intense when Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church in Rome, setting the stage for centuries of religious-based persecution, slaughter, and the so-called Protestant ascendancy, which was in effect an apartheid system favoring English and Anglo-Irish non-Catholic landowners. The quest for Irish independence had taken its modern dramatic form in the years leading up to World War I, as the Home Rule movement took the debate to the halls of the English Parliament. This simmering of tensions and unfulfilled expectations broke out in the Easter Rising of 1916. In the armed insurrection and later political fallout that ensued, hundreds were killed and parts of Dublin left in ruin. This set the stage for nearly a century of continued Irish and English fighting, as the Irish Civil War and the actions of groups such as the Irish Republican Army birthed the new century into an era of near constant violence. This was especially true in the Ulster province of Northern Ireland, a region synonymous with domestic strife and terrorism. If you were to study this period of Irish history, you would come across some legendary names, such as Michael Collins, Ewan MacNeill, and Eamon del Valera, to name a few. Yet you would also find another name, distinct not only for its national origin, but also for its gender. Countess Constance Markiewicz is a name that holds its own weight in the discussions of this period of Irish history. Yet the surname is certainly not one that is native to Ireland. Her story, as well as that of her husband, Count Kazimierz Markiewicz, is the topic of our conversation today, and brings into relevance the lesson in Irish history that was the introduction to our show. Born into an Anglo-Irish aristocratic family in 1868, Constance found herself in the burgeoning intellectual and artistic literary set that was beginning to take hold in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Kazimierz, an artist and writer in his own right, met Constance, and the two would marry and settle in Dublin in 1903. This set the stage for their avant-garde lives, which was to eventually find Constance in Irish revolutionary circles. Our guest today, Dr. Lauren Arrington, is an author and professor of English and has written a book on the pair entitled Revolutionary Limes. As you will soon hear, we were fortunate that she was able to sit down with us and share her knowledge of them, as well as the place they fit into Polish and Irish history. So, Professor Dr. Lauren Arrington of the University of South Florida, a professor of English, the chair of the Department of English, actually. And we are so delighted to have you on here today to talk about Count and Countess Markiewicz.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
And so I mean, your background is in English, obviously English language, and also Irish studies. You know, you have a master's from University College Dublin, and looks like you studied in the UK and Ireland for a long time. And so, other than, I mean, Countess Markiewicz is kind of one of these names that you hear in circles with Del Vera, Michael Collins, when people start talking about Irish history. So, what, other than her notoriety in that sense, what drew you to study her and her husband, who is, kind of the tie-in here, being a primarily Polish history podcast?
Thanks. So, when I was doing my doctoral research, I was writing about the Irish theater, and my first book was about the Irish theater in the 20s and the 30s primarily. But I also, as background, of course, was looking at the Irish theater at the turn of the century in a period that was known as the Irish Revival, when there's a resurgence and also a way of an invention of an Irish identity, and the theater is the place where that's performed. So after I finished my first book, in the course of that research, I had come across theater productions that Kazimierz Markiewicz had been involved in Dublin during those first decades of the 20th century. And I was interested in the kind of theater that he was producing, in particular a play that he and Constance Markiewicz co-wrote called The Memory of the Dead, which is about a kind of Irish rebellion that happened at the end of the 18th century, 1798. So I started looking into that play and its political importance, like in the early 20th century. And I started reading biographies of Constance Markiewicz, who's best known as a political actor, right, in the Irish national story, and not so much as a creative artist. I started reading her biographies because there have been many of her in order to learn more about Kazimierz Markiewicz. And what I was finding in those biographies was not really matching up with what I was seeing in the primary source material I was looking at. So newspaper archives, a few letters, photographs, original versions of these play scripts. So I thought, why not mount a corrective and write a biography of Constance and also of Kazimierz Markiewicz, because I was seeing that they had very much a collaborative relationship creatively, as well as in terms, of course, of their domestic life. So I decided to write a double biography of them.
In reading your book and kind of what I know about the sort of the Irish history and the Irish revival, as you called it, and the sense that there was this sense that Irishness, if you want to call it that, wasn't necessarily a thing. They were so tied into England for centuries that their language had, was very much repressed. They didn't have this kind of strong literature tradition, which, and it's kind of funny. I'm very big into genealogy, and people talk about people coming over, and then how it manifested itself here as well in the U.S. And what kind of drew me to this, which is, Countess Markiewicz. I mean, Markiewicz is not an Irish name, and so how they did kind of get together. And when you start looking into their biographies, and you see that they were part of this arts set, and in the kind of this bohemian existence, and how much of that really infused the Irish national identity, and then led up to the events of the Easter Rising and the Civil War. So just, I mean, maybe talk a little bit more about that, like how, because in the sense that the Irish independence movement is fascinating, because it's, when you have the Easter Rising, for instance, in it, they were reading the declaration, and there were people walk in front of the post office, and there were people walking by, and it just like kind of shrug it off. They expected to kind of be this national groundswell that didn't really happen. Part of that might have been disorganization, but there really wasn't that. So how did kind of their portrayals in this sort of Irish independence movement, as opposed to when they were actually living it, play out as you were researching?
Yeah. So, what you say about Irish cultural identity formation is really important because we see culture being a place where political identity is created in Ireland. So, culture was a safer groundwork for creating identity than necessarily political alignments, because there were the idea of how Ireland should stand politically in relation to the British Empire was obviously a contentious topic, even among people who identified as Irish. And that's, we can talk more about it, but that's where I saw some connections in terms of Casimir Markiewicz's identity in relation to like Polish identity and also an imperial identity, which he very much embraced. So in Ireland, there was a similar kind of tension between imperial connections and a desire for varying degrees of control over Irish self-governance or Irish independence from the British Empire. And culture was a place where you could avoid those kinds of particular questions and create a sense of identity that would aid an Irish movement. And people hoped there would be various outcomes as a result of that cultural movement. But they avoided talking about them in order to get as much, we might say now, like buy-in for what they wanted to achieve on the cultural stage. And so to see people like W.B. Yeats, of course, who's one of the 20th century's most famous poets, co-creating an Irish theater, an Irish national theater, as a place for his own literary experimentation foremost, but also as a place to kind of create a kind of cultural cohesion. And that's where Constance actually appears on the stage, and where Casimir and Constance play I mentioned earlier is produced. So Constance Markiewicz comes from this Anglo-Irish family, so a family that has deep connections to British colonization of Ireland and very strong political ties, still in familial ties to London. So she meets Casimir in Paris, and when she meets him, he is a Polish man, but also is tied to a kind of Russian imperial identity. That was one of the most surprising things for me when I was writing this book, was how complex those ideas of identity are. So I think they were in very much a similar place in terms of their conflicting ideas about national cultural identity and imperial identity. They didn't always see those identities as being in conflict, but as the 20th century moves forward and political separatist movements gain ground, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain an imperial identity that's at odds with a national identity.
Yeah, I was really struck by that. In like I said, in reading the kind of the background of Casimir, and that evolving, both of them did evolve over the lifetimes. I mean, it was, you had kind of uh, the what they said, and I guess that's everybody. You're kind of young, and you sort of move on. But in sense of, I think you can kind of track national identity through that as well, because knowing the history of Poland, where it was, you did have this high-handed, even the part of the Polish upper classes that were in league with the empires that ran the country. But then you also had these series of uprisings, 1863 being the big one, where there was kind of this leadership that also was agitating against imperial rule. So in Polish history, it's written through this lens of this nationalistic sentiment that wasn't necessarily at play at the time. And so it's really interesting how they evolved. And then Constance's trend towards Bolshevism, and how that, kind of put at odds with how Count Casimir seemed to embrace his new national identity, as it were. If maybe you could talk a little bit about how the parallels between the sort of the Irish independence movement and then the later the Polish independence movement. I mean, we can go back to the kind of imperial stuff, but I did have there was a quote that I had pulled out that I thought was very telling, and it was from your book, and it said this was Countess Markiewicz. She said, "When I was in Poland, the Poles said to me, 'Ireland will be free. Her case is not hopeless like ours. She has not been partitioned, and God Himself has given her a boundary, the sea. But Poland, poor Poland, what is she? Where are her frontiers? Partitioned and broken, she can never be reinstated. To win her freedom, 3 empires must be swept away.'" So that was a great quote, by the way. That's just full of that sort of 19th, 20th century, speech. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting is I don't think that she had that impression of Poland when she first visited. So I think it's firstly important to define what we mean when we talk about Poland in terms of Casimir's family, because they're actually living on an estate that's in the Polish settled Ukraine, right? It's a place with mixed cultural and national identities that are very much delineated alongside class lines. So the what we might call like the Polish ascendancy, like the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, right, are the landed gentry effectively, and the politically powerful people in the country. And then the Ukrainian identity is more what's often referred to as like a shorthand, like a peasant's identity, right? In that part of Poland. So when she first visits, Casimir's estate is very familiar to her because of that differentiation of culture and social class and identity. Because in Ireland, you would have had an Irish speaking agrarian class that is subjugated to the landed class, which is the British descendants, you might say, now Irish, but descended from that British imperial power. So when she goes to Poland, Casimir's estate, she meets this agrarian class, right, linguistically and culturally different to the landed class of Casimir's family. So there are really strong similarities in terms of their family backgrounds and their political position. Casimir and she they start off in the same place in terms, I think, largely in the same place in terms of the way that they think about themselves and the way that they think about the idea of nation. But as the time progresses, we see Constance really listening to the importance of self-governance. And she reads very deeply into actually political theory and Marxist thought in terms of the distribution of wealth and power, and is very swayed by those ideas and is willing to give up actually in her day-to-day a lot of the comforts and power associated because of her family's position. So she forsakes all of that. Casimir doesn't, and he's very much still enthralled with this like idea of imperial order, and almost like a kind of nesting doll's idea of power and identity from the empire down to the nation. So that's where they divide. That's the point. She starts looking back at her time in Poland and at Polish national identity through a different kind of guise. So she writes these propagandist pieces for Irish newspapers and pamphlets where she's using Poland as a comparison. And she's not the only one who sees that comparison, but she's a little bit duplicitous in terms of her own perception of the Polish situation.
This is kind of a segue into my next question. My next thought was, so when we talk about Count Markiewicz himself, I mean, this sort of title that he gives himself, really, because, and part of that, I mean, you look at the Polish nobility history, titles were not a thing. It wasn't the sort of the English system of peerage where you had barons and dukes and, the kind of the ascending order, marquises, earls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for him to give himself this title, I mean, and I kind of wondered about that. Was that just kind of his effort to look a little bit more of a novelty in sort of that Anglo-Irish world, or was it kind of him hearkening towards this imperial system? I'm kind of curious about that, about what your thoughts were and what your research revealed on that.
So Casimir's title is really interesting because there are different systems of sort of having the right to use a title that roughly translates as count, right? So there's the hereditary peerage system, which his family is not part of. Because they were wealthy and held a certain amount of land, they were entitled to use those titles as they referred to land ownership and social position. So it roughly translates as count. And he was quite happy for people to understand him to have had a hereditary peerage, although he did not. And Constance is even less obviously entitled to use the title countess, but it suited her. She spoke with an upper class British accent. She had a certain way of carrying herself. She was incredibly confident and graceful and self assured. So it suited her, and it kind of was a way of the explaining why she was as she started to move in increasingly like working class and Republican circles. So she kept it, and she sort of became known as the rebel countess, which was the title of the first biography of her, written by an Irish novelist, Sean O'Faolain, which is largely counterfactual and like politically spiky, but it stuck. It stuck.
In your research, were Count and Countess Markiewicz, were there a lot of examples of this kind of collaboration between Poles and Irish freedom fighters, regardless of class, that you can come across, or were they kind of a unique instance of this?
Not a lot in the time that I was looking at in terms of Constance's own life, but later it becomes an increasing touchstone for comparison in terms of a majority like Catholic identity, as like the ethno-nationalism really takes over the definition of the state. And it's important to remember that that was not necessarily the case, right? That the nation was not, and I think it's important for us to remember now in America that the nation was not defined by religion or language or even cultural practices. But as Irish society becomes increasingly conservative, it does become defined by those terms as, Catholic. Particularly, language is a little bit tricky because it is majority English speaking, although there's a revival of the Irish language that happens and takes hold in terms of the state's official publications and so on as we move through the 30s. But that's after Constance has passed away, of course.
Going off of that a little bit, I want to talk about a little bit about how religion played into the lives of Constance and Casimir. At one point, so she grew up nominally Protestant, and there was kind of this sense when they first met and they were first getting married. There was, you can read from her reflections in her letters that she was vehemently anti-Catholic, it seemed. And then later in her life, she actually converts to Catholicism. And then part of there was a quote in your book, I don't remember where it was, but it said about how she saw herself as converting from atheist to Catholic. And, the question of religion tied into Polish and Irish identity in the popular conception is very strong. I mean, it's you're the Free State of Ireland, you're Catholic. You're the Northern Ireland, you are Protestant, and never the two shall meet. And then the same thing in Poland, you kind of have this very strong Catholic identity that butts up against the Orthodox. And I'm curious, since you touched on that a little bit, I'm curious, like, to maybe talk about that a little bit, how that is, what part of that is true, what part of that is certainly not, because it does seem like, again, like, and a lot of this has been propagandized, for their own means, their own ends. But I mean, in Poland, it is such a central part of the identity. In fact, our own production, comes from a form of, because it is that the religious identity is so tied in with the cultural identity. Indeed, there was this large sense that Polish Catholicism was in a sense more Catholic than the rest of the world because there was no support from Rome for the independence movements. But then you did have these priests who were fighting in the January uprising, So maybe talk a little bit about that, not in terms of what you understand that to be the actual fact, and then also how it tied into Kazimierz and Constance's lives.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to, as you have done, articulate the way that religion is used in order to mobilize and justify like political action, particularly military action, in terms of separatist movements, and the way that's used in order to create a mass identity, because it's really one of the problems, right, with the idea of the nation state, right, and with the establishment of civil society, this strong linkage of geography and religious identity. So maybe talk a little bit about how Constance came to Catholic identity. It's really important to say that it was not the case at the time of her marriage. She remained non-Catholic, ancestrally Protestant, but atheist or agnostic, right, in terms of her religious practice. She converts to Catholicism, the best I was able to tell, during the Easter Rising, which is an urban war, which is launched in 1916, a rebellion that all sorts of organizational difficulties, and it started a day late. It was destined to fail because because of those organizational problems in terms of getting it started. It was supposed to start a day earlier, got delayed, caused all sorts of problems, all sorts of confusion. Constance is holed up in a college, the Royal College of Surgeons, which is next to St. Stephen's Green, which is one of the major battle sites in Dublin. She had been part of a garrison stationed in the Green. It's a park. They were fired on by British soldiers who were in the Shelbourne Hotel, which is a really tall building next to the Green. So they were being fired on from above. So they had to leave the park, where they had dug trenches. There's so much that's sort of strategically wrong with the way they were positioning themselves in the Rising. They had dug trenches in the Green, and if you're being fired upon from above, a trench isn't going to do you any good. So they eventually leave into this large building, college, an 18th century building next to the Green. So it's like a robust kind of fortress where she holds up with some of her fellow fighters. And they think they're going to die there. And a number of people do die in the building. And she converts while they're sheltering in the Green before they receive the message for surrender, because she wants to. It's an expression of solidarity with her friends she's been fighting with and the friends who are dying around her. So that religious conversion is an expression of political and personal solidarity. It's really a profound moment, I think, in terms of understanding the most impressive thing about her to me, which is her open-mindedness, her compassion, and her empathy, and the way she's willing to move from long-held ideas and positions into riskier ways of thinking and riskier ways of acting politically and personally.
I think that happens a lot of times where because you have this great sense of how religion can play into these movements, and when it comes to the personal expression of it, and then even just in terms of your own humanity, that can kind of get swallowed up. And in Ireland, it seems like there was this very tumultuous history. You have kind of the what was his name, Parnell. It was mentioned in James Joyce about how the church denounced him, and I think that was I might be getting my history a little mixed up, but there was and then we had the agreement between the Irish church and the English. So it's all of that, however you fall on it, and then you have the personal expression of it. And like you said, I think, Constance, I think, especially now, this terms of this modern association with socialism and Marxism as this violent, anti-human, anti-religion, anti all that is good sense, and it seems like then when these philosophies were a little bit more new, I would say. You didn't necessarily have those two going hand in hand. I mean, that's sort of the way if you correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean the perception that you're articulating really underlines how capitalism has used religion, in order to affect a certain order in society. But what could be more human than the the distribution of wealth, right? What could be more human than the recognition of the basic needs, and a sense of responsibility for your fellow citizens? And we see the legacy of ethno-nationalism in Ireland, as it took hold in the 30s, particularly in that idea of a Catholic identity that's implicitly white, and some of the violence that's happening right now in Ireland and has happened in the past couple of years against people of color, and anti-immigration movements, and a sense that it doesn't matter where you were born. If you look a certain way, then you can't be Irish, right? And you could insert a lot of different national identities there. That idea that you're not really, really, truly of the nation, right? Unless you have a specific religious, linguistic, and possibly also like physical identity.
Going off of that a little bit, having studied in the UK and Ireland and Irish and UK
Mhm.
history, but being from the United States, I mean, you have this whole history of Irish immigration, earlier Irish immigration in the wake of the famine, and then later Polish immigration, and the tension that existed between them. And it's so in a sense we have Count and Countess Markiewicz who come from these two places that are parallel in many respects. They're sort of divided up one way or another by an imperial power, have been forever many times. The people kind of express that similarly. You have the lower classes and then the upper class, like you said, and then they come here and they can be at war with each other. Now, I mean, again, there's U.S. historical reasons behind that, but and even in my own family history, I had seen that sort of expressed in discrimination. And I mean, you can read about this in the papers. And so when around the same time of the Easter Rising, and this was Irish independence movement, and there's a huge support for Irish identity and Irish independence in the United States. Um, I'm curious how knowing both these characters and or historical personalities, I should say, not characters, not in books, uh, and how it expressed itself in the United States a little bit more differently or similarly. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe just what are your impressions of that?
Because of the historical context of immigration that you mentioned, Irish politicians recognize the importance of an American constituency and also American wealth for funding various political movements in Ireland. And so there became a tradition of Irish political leaders or their descendants, in the case of people who were killed in the Easter Rising, or their widows, coming to the United States and giving lectures to Irish Americans in order to fundraise for the Irish Republic. And so they would come to the US and whip up often certain tropes in terms of Irish identity in order to get that support to take real money back in order to fund the Republican movement. And so the US was a really important sponsor, not the US, as an entity, but the US geographically. And we're not only thinking about the Northeast here, where you think about like Boston, like strong masses of Irish immigration, but also the West. So Constance Markiewicz goes all the way to Montana, where she speaks to miners in a mining camp, about the political scene in order to gain support. And at that point, she's thinking very much about working class support, and she's thinking about Irish republicanism as a Marxian, if not Marxist, idea.
That's an interesting point to bring up about her going west. Because it's and then you see people like Thomas Francis Meagher too, who winds up in Missouri, and there's the diaspora is large, as we kind of have this
Yeah.
manifest destiny westward migration. So that is an important point. You're right.
The point of comparison after the EU is established and there's open borders across Europe. You see Polish migration to Ireland because the tiger is booming, right? In the early decades of this century, there's a lot of Polish migration to Ireland. The Polish culture and Polish food becomes ubiquitous around Ireland. That is sparked actually an interest in Irish-Polish connections as well. And that there's been return migration now as the Irish economy has worsened and the situation is better in Poland. So a lot of people who emigrated have now gone back. So it's interesting that there's a fluidity there as well in terms of migration in and out of Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that a lot. I mean, because it is there's kind of like I have this dual personality. You know, I do have some Irish ancestry, mostly Polish, but I'm an Anglophile, and in terms of I was Hiberniaphile. I don't know what you call an Irish that type of thing, but I really enjoy Irish culture. There's a lot of Irish interest shows and things that I watch and read and even comedians and things like that. And you see that the Polish population being brought up here and there again, sometimes in a humorous fashion, but also just in terms. I was looking at it was the church that my 4-time great grandparents had been married in Ireland, and they had a Polish mass when I found it online, and I was like, wow, and then just reading about how cities, especially I think Limerick, there's a lot of Poles that live there now, and yeah, and I think as we especially in the US, I think we see Europe as this static thing, and it's just stuck in whenever our families had kind of left it. And we that identity of it, we've just impressed here that it's always this, it's always that, it's always Italy, it's always Poland, it's always. And then, like you said,
Mhm.
with the EU, the more open borders, that certainly has changed
That
things.
idea
So
too of migration no longer being permanent, and I think about that particularly about migration to Ireland, in the last 30 years. Before, when we think about Irish migration, you left and you never really were expected to come back. You would sort of be thrown away before you emigrated because it was probably the last time that you would see your friends and family unless they also migrated. Now there's a greater flexibility and migration isn't permanent anymore, and I think that too changes the way that we think about culture. In some ways it creates more cross fertilization, but in other ways it means that there is less assimilation or less acceptance. I suppose I would prefer to say less acceptance because there's a sense of, oh, this is just temporary. Like, we're going to go for X amount of time until we have X amount of resources saved up and then we'll leave again, for the people who are migrating. And then for the folks who are there permanently, they're thinking, oh, they're just going to go. You know what I mean? They're not really here. They're not really citizens because they're going to, go back at some point. So yeah,
yeah,
it
yeah,
creates
there's
greater tensions in a way.
yeah. Are you do you know the historian Fin Dwar by any chance?
Mm-mm,
Ever
no.
come across him? He wrote, it's a Irish history podcast. Is his main production, and I listened to it. And one of
Yeah.
the things that I had been brought up in these discussions of Irish to the United States immigration was the sense of, if when you left Ireland, it was almost as if you didn't do anything to contribute back to Ireland, if you weren't sending money back, if you weren't, it was like, oh, because he would read some of these letters, people writing back home, oh, so and so this, and it was like the letter back would be like, oh, that's all well and good, but what have you sent back to Ireland lately? Was an interesting phenomenon, which I wasn't really didn't really know about. Um, that's just a comment, I guess. It's not really there's no question. There's no question in there. That was just kind of amusing. Um, I was curious if you, so in looking at kind of a review of Constance, because I mean Constance, she's the major player here. Like you said, Kazimierz, if you're, I think if you're tied up with some major historical figure, your story's going to get the short end of the stick to a point. And so, like, if you do a search, kind of just this literature review of Constance and what her history is out there, and sort of things have been written on her, whatever, recordings, documentaries, podcasts, etc. There's a lot of times there seems, and I want to get to this question of her legacy towards the end, but there's this effort to really emphasize her femininity and her role in sort of women's suffrage movements, and her role as the major female player in the uprising. And I'm curious to what your response is to that in general, but also, was it kind of a was it just sort of a novelty that she was a woman? I mean, she was certainly tied to all these women's suffragette movements, and then because it's and if you look at sort of to go back to Poland and here, you have a lot of female participation in the various uprisings. There's this kind of famous Polish vignette that you see in the wake of the January uprising of the woman, and she's putting the Polish national costume cap on a soldier and sending them off. And there were a lot of them that did fight themselves in the uprising. So, but these societies, both of them, are very patriarchal, and they're very heavily, one way or another, they're religious in this time and era, Victorian era. It's sort of this male dominated culture, and yet you have the emphasis on this very strong woman in Constance. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit to that, since that is such an enduring part of her legacy, it seems.
It's an important point because the historiography of the Irish Revolution has changed. Because it's such a patriarchal society, there was control over the narrative of in terms of who were the participants in the Irish Revolution and how much power did they have and how much influence did they have. And because Constance Markiewicz and another Anglo-Irish woman, Maud Gonne, who also threw her weight behind the Irish Republican cause, because they were such big personalities, because they were so vocal, and because they had so much social privilege, they were sort of seen as the outliers in terms of like women of the Irish Revolution, Markiewicz and Gonne. But as archives opened up over the last 20 years particularly, historians have been able to tell a story about much more democratic participation in the Irish Revolution when it comes to working class women and girls, and the vast extent of the organization of women's societies in terms of mobilizing the Irish Revolution and also participating as armed participants in the Irish Revolution. Because for a long time there was the story that women were sort of the helper bees. They sort of ran back and forth messages, helped with supplies, did the strategic and domestic things, basically cared for the wounded, right? It's a very patriarchal idea about women's participation. But as these stories have emerged from the archive, and the Irish archivist, Dr. Katrina Crowe, has been very instrumental in opening up those archives and making them publicly accessible, historians have been able to tell a much more on-the-ground history of the Irish Revolution and the extent to which women were armed and militant participants, and that subjugated role wasn't the only role or even necessarily the major role that women played. So that's changed a lot. And the suffrage movement was really important for politically activating women and girls in Ireland. So it's quite a consistent theme that we see women politicized by suffrage. And then through suffrage, they begin thinking about these economic questions, which leads a lot of women to sort of Marxian, Marxist, socialist thought, as well as to the politically separatist idea, because there is the sense that we need a new state and women need a place in it and women need agency in the state. But by no means were women in agreement about their role and about what the priorities were in terms of the Irish separatist movement. There was a divide between women who thought, get the nation first, let's get political independence, and then we'll sort out our role in the new state, and other women who believed we need an instrumental role from the beginning. And so there was a lot of discussion and a lot of dispute within the Irish suffrage movement, and a lot of schism that happened as a result of that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. This is why I love history. I mean, there's just so many aspects to it, and history, how it's been written and depicted, and what the sort of reasons were behind that as well, is fascinating. Um, so I would like to talk a little bit about the question of legacy. The end of her, her life. She passes away, and then there's this sort of battle, if you want to call it that, over this statuary of her. There's a statue that's put up, and in particular uniform, and then it's changed later, and and sort of the in talking about how history is sort of recorded and talked about, and so Constance's legacy and Kazimierz's legacy. I mean, what is your sense of how they are relevant, how they're important, how they should, what's a proper way to remember them, and so that's not being used for either political means or what have you? What would you most like to tell people who are just, even people that are just hearing their story for the first time, sort of what their legacy kind of really should be in your estimation?
Well, I think Constance's legacy is that she really lived her ideals. She was willing to die for her ideals, and then when she didn't die, she gave away everything that she had by the end of her life in order to support the people around her. So she died in penury. She had take people in to come and live with her. She lived with others. She had a real sense of social responsibility. Towards the end of her life, one of her last political acts is she was working for the county council to advocate for public baths so that people in a particular underserved part of Dublin would have access to good hygiene, and so there was no cause too small for her to think about. She was a true democratic thinker. I think Casimir's greatest legacy is as an artist, and he is recently having a resurgence in terms of an appreciation of his skill as an artist. He was for the longest time after Constance passed away and Casimir had left Dublin, and his legacy was really as a kind of hard drinking buffoon. That's how Sean O'Whalan depicted him in that first biography of Constance, and that was a reputation that stayed for the rest of the 20th century. And then I came along, and at the same time as I was working on Casimir, a man named Pat Quigley started writing a biography of Casimir, and he was interested in those Irish-Polish connections as a result of that cross-cultural migration that we were talking about earlier. And that really helped correct the record in terms of the extent of Casimir's artistic career, the importance of the work that he was doing in Paris, the skill, particularly around his portraiture. And just a couple of months ago, the Polish embassy sponsored an exhibit of Casimir's work in Dublin, which was curated by Emily Mark Fitzgerald and Katie Milligan. And it was a celebration of Casimir. So it's amazing to think about him having his own show in Dublin, in 2025, a little over 100 years since he left the city. So,
yeah, and so when you study a historical figure, I've come across this myself. You really start to, I think, get to know them in a way. I'm curious, what do you think if Count Kazimir and Constance were here today? What do you think they would think of their legacy and how it's represented?
yeah, I think Constance would be proud of the way that her actions outweighed some of the very prejudicial accounts of her life. I think it's a real testament to the impact that she had on Irish politics, but more so Irish society, that she was enough people remembered her and the good that she did. Very prejudicial accounts weren't the loudest, I guess I would say. Casimir is a little bit harder because he was not as flexible as Constance. I think he wasn't as smart as her. He wasn't as willing to consider other points of view. he really stuck with the ideas that he had been taught, as he was growing up. And I don't know that he ever saw the negative impact of empire in Europe. I don't think he was ever able to recognize that. He fights for the Russian Imperial Army in the First World War. He's discharged because he's ill. He gets typhus. He's injured. That was really interesting for me to learn because I used a research assistant who was fluent in Russian military archives to kind of find out as much as we could about his military career. And the fact that he voluntarily enlisted to fight for the Russian Imperial Army, and that he maintained this Polish national identity that didn't recognize the impact of Polish expansion, right, into other territories. I don't really like him as a figure. He's fascinating, and I think it's important. And he tells an important story about the complexity of political identity in Central Europe in the early 20th century. And he was a wonderful artist, but I think he must have been infuriating to live with.
Oh, I very much agree. Just to I mean, from what I read of him, yeah, he sounded incredibly arrogant, and just yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up the World War I story, because when I was reading about him, and I was like, man, I would love to know more about what that service was like, because that Carpathian front was god awful. I mean, it
Yeah.
was awful. I mean, I think they stumble across remains in those mountain passages every once in a while from the First World War, and the First World War in general, especially on that Eastern Front, was really bad. Even in, I know my trips to Poland, because my family's from the northeast part, and that was there was a heavy fighting area there. And when I was digging through archives and things, doing genealogical research, there was much more destruction during the First World War than there was the second, like physical destruction during the First World War than there was even during the second in that area. So yeah, it's an era that's maybe not as well documented, and it's probably because, well, number one, it was chaotic due to the fall of the Russian Empire in the wake of the war, I think, and sort
Yeah.
of the tumult that came through there. I might have to ask you for that name of that person who helped you out with that
Yeah.
later, just to further my own
Yeah, I
research.
mean, yeah, and I really came up against the bureaucracy of archives and the way that archives are politically manipulated when you think about Russian history and right and the restructuring of the Russian state at crucial points, and what happens to archives and the way that materials are valued or not, and the way that they're where the material is placed says so much, right, about the way that the country is constructing or reconstructing its identity. And so Casimir, that period of Casimir's service was really difficult to find because of the way that the Soviet Union considered and contextualized and preserved Russian imperial actions during the First World War. So
It can be maddening too, dealing with those sort of communist era bureaucrats in archives throughout Eastern Europe. And you're right about that. As a historian, when I look at sort of the revisionists and the Institute for Polish National Remembrance is a big purveyor of this, and I mean their former head is now the newly elected president of Poland, and in terms of having to showcase their history as you know everyone was fighting against the communists, no one were seen to be collaborators ever. It's fascinating how we continue to use history to meet our own ends and our own ethnographic concerns.
history is so important, right? That's why the humanities are so important. That's what history and literature does for us, is it really helps us to contextualize and frame and understand why the world we're living in as it is, and to be critical, in a positive way, I mean, like, to examine and analyze like the narratives that we're presented with, and to question those. Yeah, just absolutely, I agree with you.
I think if historians were in charge, there, things would be a lot different. But anyway, not historians and those who study literature, not to leave out. So I don't know if there's anything you want to particularly mention. We talked about a lot. That's totally up to you. I'll kind of give you the floor for kind of some final thoughts.
I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a really fun conversation about them. My book is in paperback, Princeton University Press, so I can send you the link that maybe you can share with listeners if anybody would like to read it. And I really appreciate you reading it, Michael, and for reaching out to me. This has been great. So.
According to statistics, 39 million Americans claim some degree of Irish ancestry. In many cases, they also share Polish and Irish DNA, as immigrant groups settled and intermarried over the last century and a half. In Ireland itself, some 100,000 Poles now reside, making it the second largest ethnic group in the Emerald Isle, and the third most spoken language after English and Gaelic Irish. Perhaps it's time that the statement I mentioned at the beginning of our episode that, quote, everyone is Irish except Polish on St. Patrick's Day, is in need of some revision. To enact a final movement on from its early 20th century divisive connotations may bring some manner of justice to an era so fraught with bigotry. Whether you find yourself wearing green on St. Patrick's Day or not, it cannot be ignored that the ties between Poles and Irish are just too numerous to disregard. As we've seen, an example of how this is made most evident is in the Polish surname of Markiewicz, finding itself among the most legendary names in the Irish independence story. If nothing else, the story of Constance as someone who embodied a set of strong principles that also evolved over time, and yet were still firmly rooted in the expression of humanity and the plight of its most forgotten members, is a lesson we all could take with us today as we confront the challenges to human dignity and society that we find ourselves presented with in the 21st century. If you'd like more information on Kazimierz and Constance Markiewicz, check out our social media pages this month, as well as links to Dr. Arrington's book. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, review, and share our podcast, and find us on social media. By subscribing, you can stay up to date on all of our recent episodes, and by reviewing, you can greatly enhance our visibility. You can also reach out to us at pierogideprayer@gmail.com, or better yet, visit us at 10 a.m. each and every Sunday at our home at St. Joseph's in Camden. Don't forget to listen to our next episode later this week featuring our Polish Saint of the Month. And until next time, salte some pierogi and sit with a saint. Dziękujemy, thank you, do usłyszenia. And this month, I suppose I should also appropriately sign off with the Irish word for goodbye, slán. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly.